All right, we have Dr. Bob Godfrey back on the program today. Good to see you again, Bob.
I'm glad to be back. I'm glad I passed the test and I got invited a second time. That's
the first one, yeah, it was kind of controversial. So, you know.
Me?
We didn't. No, that's usually Scott Clark. Sorry. He'll laugh when he hears
Absolutely.
this.
Absolutely.
No, it's good to have you back. Last time we discussed, I think, some really helpful things in light of the culture and the question that you've wrestled a lot with is, you know, how to be reformed in America. And that's been a challenging thing for us. You talked about how we lost ground to the Methodists and the Baptists and didn't realize we had lost such ground. But maybe one of those areas that we have lost ground is the area and the practice of worship. Christian worship, right?
We're going to do something non-controversial this time.
That's exactly right. Why not just dive into the most controversial issue that we can do? But isn't that the heart of a lot of our challenge of being reformed in America? Is our view of worship, what it is, that for a variety of different reasons, a lot of American Christians don't find what we do historically as Reformed churches as attractive. And attractive is probably not the best word, but
that's right. And it's easy to perceive the Reformed who are holding to traditional Reformed worship as just being traditionalists,
right.
You know, and it's easy to assume that we hold on to that just because we like it, and other people are doing what they like, so, you know, we should get off everybody's back because we're all just doing what we like. But I think, for me at least, I try to think that that's not the case, that there are theological issues, and maybe we could even say fundamental issues of religion that are more foundational to this whole question that we need to get at. It's not a matter of what do I like. It may not even be a matter of what do I find personally edifying, but the crazy question that I think John Calvin would press on us is, what is God like in worship?
Right. So at the time of the Reformation, I remember being examined years ago for ministry, and somebody said, well, what were some of the main issues of the Reformation? What was the issue of the Reformation? And I think it would be proper to say that worship was a very important issue for the Reformers at the time of the Reformation.
Absolutely. Calvin, in his famous treatise on the necessity of reforming the church, said that the most pressing issue was the issue of worship, and that the issue of salvation was the second most. Now, most people, I think, are surprised when they hear that Calvin said that. They would say, well, the Reformation was all about justification. It was all about salvation. And I think what Calvin rightly saw, because he was such a superbly balanced theologian and pastor, what he rightly saw was that salvation is a means to an end, whereas worship is the end. Worship, our fellowship with God, our communion with God, our meeting with God, that's the whole point of being saved. And so I think Calvin was absolutely right about that.
So I think it's Horton Davies. In his book, one of those books on worship that he wrote, he has a bunch of liturgies in the back that came out of the Reformation and throughout Reformed churches. And those are still liturgies we use to this day to some degree, at least a similar sort of flow in those liturgies that tie back all the way to the Reformation. But
actually a lot further back than that. I mean, a lot of those are really based in fundamental ways on ancient church liturgies.
Right. And that's my question. So when we had the Reformation that was recovering those things for what our view is when we come before the presence of God, what happened along the way? And this is why it's nice to have a historian that I can, prod and...
What happened along the way?
What happened along the way? Especially I'm thinking of American evangelicalism, that at least historically, that we moved away from those convictions, elements, circumstances, what a liturgy is, what reverence, what caused and led us to this. This is a big question. It's probably an unfair question that you can't answer in a few moments. But what led us to get to where we are today, where there's such a disregard for these things?
Well, I think a relatively short answer is that once the dust settled after the Reformation, in the later part of the 17th century, and you had places like England and Scotland with established Protestant churches that had Orthodox confessions and relatively traditional Orthodox forms of worship. This would be true to some extent in the Netherlands, Switzerland, Germany. And the government was supporting these churches, and because of a combination of the churches being established and government action, most people had joined these churches. The leadership of the churches looked around and said, okay, the church externally is in good shape. We have good worship. We have educated clergy. We have Orthodox confessions. We have lots of people coming to church. How many of those people who are coming are really converted? Mm-hmm. Is formalism now our problem? We've dealt, in a sense, with the problem of heresy or profound error in the life of the church. But now we're confronting this situation of formalism. How do we ensure that all these people coming to church are really engaged, are really have had their hearts transformed, have true faith? And I think that in the late 17th and on the 18th century became one of the pressing concerns of church leadership. What do we do to try to ensure that people are really believing what they say they believe, really believe what the church says they ought to believe? And that led to, more and more emphasis on things like revival, renewal, where's the Spirit of God going to work? And once you begin down that path of focusing on formalism, it becomes very tempting to move from saying we're waiting on the Spirit to move to what can we do to try to make the Spirit's work more likely? Mm-hmm. And you begin to move into what becomes I think J.I. Packer called it sort of the technology of revivalism. You begin to look for methods of overcoming formalism, and it leads to Methodism.
Yeah. I think I saw the other day, and you can correct me if this is not right, but I think I saw that Queen Elizabeth passed a series of injunctions to the clergy, really directing their worship. And that she actually gave laws and commands to try to preserve the worship. I saw this on eBay. I wanted to buy it, but it was too expensive. I didn't have the chance to read it, but it seemed like that's exactly what she was doing, was trying to direct the Protestant churches.
Well, she was. She also hated the idea that all these idiot ministers every Sunday could get up in a pulpit and say whatever they wanted. What she really wanted was a book of sermons that they would just read through.
Well, there were appointed sermons, weren't there?
There were, but she was never able entirely to eliminate free sermons, which is what she would have liked to do. So you got to be aware of putting your eggs in the royal basket.
Right. But I guess what I'm thinking about is how Christendom affected that formalism.
Right.
Is what I'm saying.
Right.
And how there seems to have been a great reaction to that in the American experiment.
Right. I mean, that's another piece of the puzzle. Things happen seldom by a single causation, and that's why when you make generalizations, you're easily going to get something wrong. But I think
that's why we have a historian.
Yeah. But I think that's why you begin to see, for example, in the 18th century, serious changes to the church's music. Mm-hmm. Most Reformed churches certainly were psalm singing in the 17th and early 18th century. But the psalm singing had declined in quality, so that a lot of places, they were singing all the psalms to just a few tunes. Mm-hmm. And it had become kind of dead and boring. Mm-hmm. The Psalms, because there weren't musical instruments in most of those churches,
Right.
the Psalms were lined so that you had a precentor singing a line and the congregation repeating it. So it was a kind of dead experience in contrast to the liveliness of psalm singing in the 16th century Reformed churches. And
which was beautiful.
beautiful. And there's still controversies, some people wanted to sing in harmony, and Calvin wouldn't allow that. So there were still issues. But so then in the 18th century and on into the 19th century, of course, you begin to see music wars in the church. What should we sing? How should we sing it? And music becomes one of the avenues by which more emotion is brought into the service, with the hopes that'll overcome formalism.
Yeah, I think that's right. So the instrument thing is interesting too in this whole thing,
right?
Because when I don't know how many American Christians stop and realize these things, but that our heritage is really singing only in the inspired Psalms and without instrumentation. And if you say that today, you're viewed as, the worst kind of oppressive person, I think.
Well, yeah, and it is. I think it's just a human reaction that we assume what we do must be what people have always done.
Right.
And the truth is, as far as we know, musical instruments were never used in Christian worship anywhere until around the year 1000. So for 1,000 years, Christians did not have musical instruments in their churches. You can argue that that's good, bad, or indifferent, but that's the fact.
That's the fact.
And that ancient tradition is carried on by the Greek Orthodox churches to this day. They have no musical instruments in their churches. Mm-hmm. So that's a widespread practice, whether you like it or not. And Calvin opposed musical instruments in part because he thought that's what he found in the Bible, but also because that's what Christian tradition taught him by studying that Christian tradition. And I'm not here to raise that issue per se, but just to remind us that if we really want the big picture, what we do is rather different from what the church has historically done.
Right. So, sensationalism, enthusiasm, all these movements that were trying to pull out the perception of dead orthodoxy along the way to try to revive worship into something that was a better experience was characteristic of American worship in the 19th century.
Well, I think what you see is first you see an introduction of hymns,
right, that
are always introduced initially to supplement Psalms, but usually over time drive out the Psalms. Mm-hmm. You can see that for a variety of reasons. The Psalms are written in Hebrew. They have to be translated. And then they are not written in an obvious meter. Mm-hmm. So then they have to be rendered metrical. Mm-hmm. And then you have to try to find a tune that fits. But Psalms keep changing their moods in the middle. Mm-hmm. So a tune that fits the first part of a psalm may not so well fit the second part of the psalm. So it's tricky to produce a good singable psalter. Mm-hmm. Whereas hymns usually maintain a single mood through the hymn, and it's easier then to find a tune that works. And the poet most of our hymns were written in English. The poet is functioning in his own language. He's creating a meter intentionally as he goes along. He's able to rhyme often, he or she, easily. And so it's understandable that hymns will sometimes initially feel more accessible, mm-hmm. more aesthetically and emotionally satisfying.
Yeah. But confusing because, well, I saw the other day a group of people singing America the Beautiful, and all the hands were up and swaying. I thought to myself, that looks like a modern worship service. Do they realize they're singing, they're praising America, right?
Yes.
So the sheer feeling had governed everything that they were doing, not so much the words and what was being said. Maybe it had something to do with the words and being said, but there was a confusion with, what they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there were some interesting observations about 19th century revivalism in the 19th century, warning about getting too focused on feelings and assuming feelings were an indication of religious reality that may not be true. It was Robert Dabney, I think, who made the famous statement that there are thousands of souls in hell because they couldn't distinguish between animal feelings and genuine religious feelings.
That's a stunning quote.
It is. It is.
Yeah, which really, in all of this discussion, we seem to along the way have lost the single great question: what does God want?
Right.
What does God command? Does God command our worship, and for what reason and purpose? I mean, Jesus addressed false worship of his day,
right?
And he was obviously very concerned about people who drew near with their lips in mere formalism, but whose hearts were far from him. But it wasn't that the prescribed ways that God had commanded in light of his attributes to be worshiped were something that were intended to accomplish and promote mere formalism.
Right. And, I think often in contemporary discussions of worship, we can get sidetracked from the most important question to questions that are important but a little bit secondary. And as I've thought about this, I think the most important question is, in terms of our examining our own hearts when it comes to worship, is are we eager to hear the Word of God? Do we come to worship to meet with God and to be sure that we can speak to Him, but in the first place that He can speak to us? And I think this is a real measure of what's going on in American evangelical worship, that people come to hear a preacher who's entertaining, and there may be some scriptural content, but too often, I'm afraid, an awful lot of it is just the entertainment value of the preacher, or the entertainment value, the feeling, emotional value of the music. And so we have to ask, have I come to meet with God? Have I come to hear God speak to me? And if that's not the central motive, then our worship is very likely to become seriously distorted.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. What is the general reason that people come to worship on a Sunday? What do they think is happening? And part of this we have to blame of the modern challenges with worship and the confusion of worship with the preacher himself, right? Who hasn't communicated that what's happening there is what the Old Testament prophets were told to do, thus saith the Lord. Right? To make central the word in what we're doing. If you lose that, and I think you can see this in the loss of evening worship in our country, that really what we've done is devalue what's happening so that we haven't really trained and taught people that anything important is happening when we corporately gather. If you lose that, then what happens in that is not going to have a lot of meaning.
Right. And, there were all sorts of ways in which the development of American Protestant religion sent that signal to people. I can remember when Mary Ellen and I were dating, and we would go to her Baptist church occasionally. There was often an invitation to attend the Wednesday night prayer meeting, which was always declared to be the most important meeting of the week. That was hyperbolic language to encourage people to come to the prayer meeting. I understood that. But if you say it's the most important meeting of the week, then you're really saying it's the most important meeting of the week because that's where really serious Christians gather to do the really serious work of prayer. Now, of course, most of the prayer meeting was Bible teaching, not praying, but still. But But it also, of course, says subliminally, the Sunday morning worship is our formal time to get together, but it's not the most important meeting of the week. It's not the really crucial thing. And then we have Sunday school. I'm a great believer in Sunday school. But you can begin to say, morning worship doesn't do it, so we have to supplement that with Sunday school. Yeah. And as I say, I'm a big supporter of Sunday school. But there are various ways in which we can communicate that our formal gathering to worship is not as important as these other things, which, because they're more informal and personal, and perhaps you can do more informal things there. You can overcome the formality. And so we have to be very careful what we communicate.